Hollowbrook had always been a town of secrets. Secluded by dense, shadowy woods, the town sat in a valley untouched by time, like a relic of the past. Few visitors made it to the winding streets, and even fewer left. It was as though the town was a place apart from the rest of the world, a small, quiet haven, until the fog rolled in. Margaret Watson, now in her mid-30s, had known nothing but Hollowbrook her whole life. She had married Charles, a quiet woodworker who spent his days carving intricate designs for local craftsmen. They had raised 2 children in a house at the edge of the forest, a sprawling, old farmhouse that creaked and groaned with every wind that swept through. The house had been in Charles's family for generations, and the land too, untouched and sacred, a living connection to their ancestors. But recently, Margaret had begun to feel the weight of something unseen pressing against her chest, as though the house itself was growing heavier, and with it, her anxiety. She woke each morning with a sense of dread she couldn't shake, the unsettling feeling that someone, something, was watching her from the woods. On the evening of October 31st, the feeling reached its peak. The air was colder than usual, and the wind howled with an eerie intensity. Margaret sat alone in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring a pot of soup, staring out of the window at the thick fog that had settled over the yard. She saw no movement, heard no sound from the street. The town was unnaturally still. And then, just as she turned away from the window, she heard it, the soft knock at the door. 3 raps. No more, no less. It was not the knock of a casual visitor. It wasn't the sound of a traveler seeking shelter or a neighbor dropping by for a friendly chat. It felt deliberate, as though the very air in the house had held its breath, waiting for the sound to come. Margaret froze. Her heart thudded in her chest. It was a peculiar knock, one that seemed to reverberate through the walls of the house. She set down the spoon and walked cautiously toward the door, her steps muffled by the soft carpet. The air in the hallway felt colder now, the shadows in the corners stretching longer. When Margaret reached the door, she hesitated. Her hand lingered over the knob, and a primal instinct warned her to look through the peephole. But there was no one. No shadow, no outline, just the fog. Taking a breath, she opened the door. Standing before her was nothing but a figure cloaked in black. The man was tall, his entire form obscured by the heavy darkness of his cloak. His face was hidden behind a smooth, white mask, its expression neutral, yet unsettling. He made no move to speak or even acknowledge her presence, his head slightly tilted, as if studying her every movement. Margaret's breath hitched. There was something undeniably wrong about this encounter, something far more than mere unease. The stranger didn't speak, nor did he move. He simply stood there in the mist, waiting for her to say something. "Can I help you?" Margaret managed to ask, though the words seemed to catch in her throat. Her mind screamed to close the door, to retreat to the safety of her home, but her body was rooted in place. For a long moment, the figure did not respond. Then, slowly, the figure lifted a gloved hand, extending it toward her, as though offering something, though there was nothing in his grasp. Margaret felt a strange pull, an almost magnetic force that urged her to reach for it. Something about the man's presence was hypnotic, luring her in like a moth to a flame. She took a step back. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice quieter now, trembling. The figure remained still, his head tilting even further. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned, stepping back into the fog, vanishing without a sound. Margaret closed the door quickly, locking it behind her. The knock had stopped, but the sensation of being watched lingered. She leaned her back against the door, trying to steady her racing heart, but the feeling refused to leave. The days that followed were strangely uneventful. The wind died down, and the fog lifted, returning Hollowbrook to its usual serene state. Margaret tried to dismiss the incident, telling herself it had been some strange hallucination brought on by stress or exhaustion. But deep inside, a nagging feeling remained. The knock, the figure in the mist, it all felt too real, too deliberate. When Margaret told Charles about it, he shrugged it off. "You've been working too hard," he said, his voice soothing. "You're tired. Maybe you're seeing things." But Margaret couldn't shake the sense that something had changed. That night, as she prepared dinner, the air felt heavy with something else, something unsettling. She felt as though the house itself was holding its breath. She glanced over at the children, Sarah, her 10-year-old daughter, and little Thomas, who was barely 6. Both were unusually quiet, their eyes distant as they played together at the table, their voices unnervingly muted. The next morning, Sarah confided something that froze Margaret's blood. "I saw him again," Sarah whispered. Her small voice was barely audible, her eyes wide with fear. "The man with the mask. He was standing by the oak tree last night, watching me." Margaret's blood ran cold. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" she asked, trying to sound calm. But the words caught in her throat as Sarah continued. "He just stood there," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I couldn't move, Mama. He was so still. I thought he might hurt me." Margaret's mind raced. It wasn't just her who had seen the figure. Sarah had seen him too. She turned to Charles, but the look in his eyes was distant, unfocused, as though he couldn't truly see the gravity of the situation. "Charles, something's wrong," Margaret whispered, feeling a lump form in her throat. "Something is happening to this house, to us. We have to do something." But Charles simply smiled weakly and patted her hand. "You're imagining things, love. There's nothing to worry about." But Margaret knew. Something was coming, and it wasn't just her imagination. It wasn't long before the symptoms of the town's strange affliction grew harder to ignore. Margaret would wake to find things moved from where she left them. Her knitting on the windowsill, the rug pulled to one side, and the mirror inexplicably covered with a layer of condensation. Charles had begun to look ill, sallow and weak, his once muscular frame growing thinner by the day. He insisted it was just fatigue, but Margaret knew better. There was something else at play here, something that was draining him. Margaret had heard stories from the town's elderly that spoke of a figure who took the life force of its victims, a being who could slip in and out of the world unnoticed, feeding off fear and despair. The more Charles grew ill, the more Margaret's fear deepened. One night, the knock came again. This time, she knew what she had to do. It was no longer a question of if this was real. It was a question of how she would face it. She grabbed her coat and went to the library, seeking out the only person in the town who might know something, Mrs. Hawthorne. The old librarian's eyes narrowed when Margaret mentioned the masked figure. "Don't go looking for answers you aren't ready to find," Mrs. Hawthorne warned, her voice low. "Some things are better left buried. The masked man comes for souls. He chooses his victims. If he's come for you, there's little that can be done. But what can I do?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, filled with panic. "You can make a deal," Mrs. Hawthorne said grimly. "But be careful. No bargain comes without a cost." Margaret knew what she had to do. The masked man had come, and it wasn't just for her. It was for them all. The house, the land, and the people in it, everything was connected. She could feel the presence growing stronger, its grip tightening around her family. The next evening, as the fog rolled in once more, Margaret opened the door. This time, the figure stood at the threshold, his mask as white and emotionless as before. "I'm ready," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "Take me. Let my family go." The masked man stepped forward, his cloak swirling around him like smoke. Without a word, he extended his hand. Margaret reached out and took it. The moment their fingers touched, she felt the chill of the void seeping into her soul, an icy grip tightening around her heart. "You understand the cost?" the masked man's voice echoed in her mind. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand." The fog thickened as Margaret stepped into the night. The trees whispered and the wind howled, but all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. As the masked man led her into the woods, her body grew lighter, her senses fading into nothingness. She had made her choice. The masked man led Margaret deeper into the woods, where the air grew colder with every step. The trees twisted above her like gnarled hands reaching toward the sky, their branches creaking as if they too were alive. As they walked, the path beneath their feet seemed to shift, as though the forest itself was shifting, moving to keep them on the path it had chosen. Margaret felt the weight of the decision she had made settle over her like a heavy shroud. The coldness in the air was unlike anything she had ever felt before. It was as though she was walking into a place that existed outside of time, a space where the rules of the living world no longer applied. The masked man walked silently beside her, his presence both suffocating and strangely soothing. His cloak rippled with an unnatural rhythm, and though his footsteps made no sound, Margaret felt his every movement. She dared not speak, for fear that the silence between them would shatter and reveal the true nature of the bargain she had struck. "Why?" Margaret asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why take me? Why not just leave us in peace?" The masked man did not respond immediately. Instead, he stopped walking and turned to face her. His white mask was smooth and featureless, but Margaret felt a weight of something, an emotion behind it. Was it pity, satisfaction, or something darker? "Because," he said, his voice resonating in her mind, "your soul is what is needed to free the others. Without it, this town will be lost. They will all perish in the fog." Margaret froze, understanding creeping into her heart like ice. She had not just been chosen to end her own suffering. She had been chosen to save Hollowbrook. The realization hit her like a wave, knocking the breath from her chest. "But how can I save them?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "What will happen to me?" The masked man raised his gloved hand, and a faint glow emanated from beneath his cloak. It was as though the night itself bowed to his will, and the air around them seemed to bend in response. The glow pulsed like a heartbeat, and Margaret felt herself drawn to it, as though her very essence was being pulled toward whatever was hidden in the shadows. "Your sacrifice is the price," he answered softly, but his words carried an undeniable weight. "Once the bargain is struck, you will become one with the forest. Your soul will feed the land, and the town will be free. It will return to its rightful place, unburdened by the curse that has plagued it for centuries." Margaret felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She was no fool. She understood the implication of his words. There was no going back. Once she made the final choice, she would be gone, lost to the world forever. Her family, her friends, would never know what had truly happened. The town would never remember her sacrifice. But there was something else in the masked man's tone. It was not a promise of peace or salvation. It was a cold inevitability, a truth that she could not escape. "And if I refuse?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. The masked man's head tilted, as if considering her question. "Then the curse will consume the town. The fog will never lift. And everyone will die, those you love, those you care about. Hollowbrook will be lost." Margaret's heart clenched in her chest. She thought of Charles, of Sarah, of little Thomas. Would they really die just like that? Would her refusal condemn them all? For a moment, she hesitated. She could feel the pull of her old life, the life she was about to leave behind. The comfort of her home, the sound of her children's laughter, the warmth of her husband's embrace. All of it would fade away in the blink of an eye. But then, a surge of love for her family swept over her, and she knew what she had to do. "I will do it," Margaret said, her voice firm despite the fear and sorrow that threatened to overtake her. The masked man nodded, the edges of his cloak swirling around him like smoke. "Then follow me," he said, his voice resonating with an eerie finality. They continued deeper into the forest, the trees now closing in around them, casting long shadows on the ground. The path was barely visible beneath the thick carpet of fallen leaves and moss, but Margaret followed without hesitation. She no longer needed to see the way. She trusted the masked man, even as a part of her screamed to run in the opposite direction. As they walked, Margaret began to sense the presence of something ancient, something far older than the trees themselves. It was as though the forest was alive, aware of her presence, aware of the bargain she had struck. The very earth beneath her feet seemed to pulse, as though it were breathing. Finally, they arrived at a clearing deep in the woods. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone altar, worn and weathered by time. Strange runes were carved into the surface of the stone, their meaning lost to the ages. The air around the altar hummed with an otherworldly energy, and Margaret felt an inexplicable chill crawl up her spine. "This is where it will happen," the masked man said softly, his voice reverberating with power. "Place your hands on the stone. The ritual will begin." Margaret stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her every step. She placed her trembling hands on the altar, and the moment her skin made contact with the cold stone, the world around her seemed to shift. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the wind howled as though the very elements were reacting to the power she had just unleashed. The masked man stepped back, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Close your eyes," he instructed. Margaret obeyed, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she felt an overwhelming sense of presence surround her. It was as if the entire forest, the very land, was reaching out to claim her. She could feel it, her soul being drawn out, inch by inch, leaving her body behind. The power was intoxicating, yet terrifying. It was as though she was being pulled into another realm, a place between life and death, where time had no meaning. Suddenly, a voice echoed in her mind, a voice that was both hers and not hers, ancient and familiar. "Do you truly wish to give yourself for them?" the voice asked. "Do you understand the cost?" Margaret's heart quaked, but she stood firm. "I do." The voice was silent for a moment, and then the masked man spoke again, his voice reverberating with power. "It is done." The world around Margaret began to fade. The fog, the trees, the clearing, everything blurred into nothingness. But in that final moment, before the darkness claimed her entirely, she saw him, Charles. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, his face etched with worry. "Margaret," he called, his voice breaking. "No, don't do it." She reached out, as though to call back to him, but the distance between them stretched endlessly. She could see the pain in his eyes, the desperation, but there was nothing she could do. She had made the choice. There was no turning back. "Goodbye, Charles," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence of the forest. "Goodbye, my love." And then the world went dark. When Margaret awoke, she was no longer in the forest. She was standing on the edge of Hollowbrook, the fog now lifted, the sky clear for the first time in years. The town looked different, as if it had been reborn, free from the curse that had plagued it for so long. She could feel the presence of the town, the heartbeat of the land, and knew that it had been freed. The weight that had once pressed upon her chest had lifted, and the town was at peace. But Margaret was not at peace. She looked down at her hands, which were translucent, fading in and out of view. Her body was no longer hers. She was a part of the land now, an ethereal presence that would forever watch over Hollowbrook. The masked man stood beside her, his cloak billowing in the wind. "You are now a part of this place," he said softly. "Your soul is woven into the fabric of the town, a guardian of sorts. You will watch, but you will never be seen." Margaret looked toward her home, where Charles and their children stood in the doorway, unaware of her presence. She longed to be with them, to hold them once more, but she knew she could never return. "I will always be here," she whispered, her voice carried by the wind, "watching over them." And so Margaret became a part of Hollowbrook, a silent watcher, her soul forever entwined with the land. The curse was lifted, and the town thrived once more, but the price of that peace was a sacrifice that would never be forgotten.